Hi there, this is SAW James from SAW James Films, and welcome to another episode of Double Take. Today we're talking about some dark bacon, some smoky bacon, some two films with darkness in them, starring everybody's favourite parlour game, Kevin Bacon. So we're going to be looking at The Woodsman from 2004, directed by Nicole Cassell, and Death Sentence from 2007, directed by James Wan, as it says, the director of SAW. You do actually kind of forget James Wan's Australian, as is Lee Winnell, who wrote SAW and appears in this film. So very much, quite a lot of Hollywood cinema is actually built on Australians. But we'll talk about Death Sentence first. This is a simple story of a man who loses his golden son in a gang initiation ceremony at a gas station, and is obviously left with his wife and the son that he doesn't quite like quite as much because he's more of a nerd than the potential professional hockey player golden boy. Obviously at the funeral it's raining. I mean, I wonder what percentage in cinema history of funerals, how many of them happen in the rain. I'm probably going to say about 80% of them happen in the rain. And at the trial of the person who did it, the gang member who did it, the prosecuting lawyer says to Kevin Bacon, I can get 3 to 5 years, and obviously he's shocked that the guy who did it isn't going to get more. So he says, it wasn't him, and he's going to exact retribution, and things start spiralling out of control, and the gang obviously don't like somebody coming after them, and things escalate and actually get a lot darker than you think they would. It is a certificate 18, which is good because there is quite a lot of gory violence, as you'd expect from the director of SAW. But it is actually a lot of fun. There's a couple of problems with it, which I'll get to. The film stars Kelly Preston as Kevin Bacon's wife, which I had actually forgotten that she died in 2020 of breast cancer. So when I checked again, it was actually quite upsetting. Not that I was a huge Kelly Preston fan or anything. I mean, she did live with John Travolta, so you'd think she'd suffered enough. It also stars John Goodman as the gun-selling father of the leader of the gang, who's only in 3 scenes, but as usual with John Goodman, he makes the best of it. He's really quite sleazy and sweaty. Obviously this is big John Goodman as opposed to the slimmed down John Goodman that we see nowadays. Obviously it has that James Wan kind of, not washed out, but that kind of strange look that all these kind of modern American gritty films have. There is a scene in the hospital where he does the shaky, blurry thing, which obviously lots of modern American filmmakers do. Obviously, if this has been written and directed by Paul Schrader, perhaps have more of a psychological examination of the thought process, of the eye for an eye. You know, there is a nice kind of background that Kevin Bacon is in, essentially risk analysis, and balancing books and balancing, you know, and he is kind of risk averse until this tragedy happens. There's a wonderful scene in a parking garage as Kevin Bacon is being chased by the gang, and it's all done in one shot as he's running about the garage, setting off car alarms and trying to get attention. The film does have a couple of unintentionally hilarious scenes, because as we know, when Hollywood wants to get serious and intense, they go to slow motion. So there's a wonderful scene where Kevin Bacon gets out of the hospital at some point during the film and is walking in the rain in slow motion, still in his hospital gown. And actually, before he leaves the hospital, he literally turns to the camera and suddenly, he's given a speech about his son, and then he literally turns to the camera and gives an intense look. So there's a couple of hilarious little Hollywood cliches that, Hollywood directors think are really intense, but they're just so cliched that they're quite funny. But as I said, there's a lot to like about it. Again, it does have strong gory violence, as it would be, so it's good to see it's an 18 and not one of those 12s with like toned down violence, so more kids can go and see the film. One of the big flaws of it is the music. It's done by Charlie Clouser, who obviously I love all of Charlie Clouser's work when he was in Nine Inch Nails with Trent Reznor, but as a film composer, I always feel his scores just don't really work that well, and he does tend to include kind of not emo songs but kind of sad songs when you're supposed to be sad. Now, whether that's a director's choice, obviously, but it is a film that I feel would have been so much better without a score at all, or just a background score but no vocals. So the number of times where we're to be sad and then a female vocalist will come in with like soaring angelic harmonies, so to confirm that we're sad now, and it does become a little bit overbearing. And if you actually went back and watched some scenes just on mute, just without any sound whatsoever, and they just work better. But again, it is obviously a Hollywood cliche as well of, my goodness, the audience won't know how to feel here, so we need to put in a sad song that definitely means they have to be sad now. And they do it about 3 or 4 times, because obviously it's a very sad film. Again, Kevin Bacon is wonderful as always. I mean, the first half is fairly realistic. The trouble he gets into is messy and it's handled pretty well. Obviously, by near the end and the climax of the film, it does get a bit silly, as Hollywood films tend to do. Again, if it was written and directed by Paul Schrader, it perhaps would be a little bit different, or if Cronenberg did it or something like that. The finale takes place in an abandoned hospital that the gang use for their drug business, which does remind one of the shootout in Hard Boiled with John Woo. And again, the action is good. As I said, there's some nice gore in the film, but again, like a lot of Hollywood films, you just feel it could have been better, just with a few different choices. And again, obviously I'm not a filmmaker, because my films would be terribly mediocre, but just with choices like let's not have music, but again, probably the studio would not have let a film out with no score. I know they did it with the Coens and No Country for Old Men, but obviously that's a little bit of a different animal. So it's a lot of fun, but could have been better. But again, Kevin Bacon is good, and we do see him struggling with what he has done and what happens. But obviously there's a couple of unintentionally funny scenes where he literally just goes full on death wish, and full on intense, and obviously the slow motion tells us he's really intense. So that's Death Sentence, a little bit dark of Kevin Bacon. The Woodsman is certainly a lot darker for Kevin Bacon, but again, I'll get into it's not perhaps as dark as it could have been. So this tells the story of Walter, played by Kevin Bacon, who is a convicted paedophile who comes out of prison after 12 years and gets a job in a lumber yard, and trying to rehabilitate himself, even though they've put him in an apartment across the road from a school. I mean, I think he says it's the only place that would actually let him stay in, even though it's across from a school. So I don't really understand that, but obviously it's for plot reasons more than anything else. Kyra Sedgwick co-stars as another worker who obviously immediately is attracted to him because he's Kevin Bacon, even though he keeps himself to himself, doesn't want trouble, obviously, doesn't want people to necessarily find out who he is and what his past is. Initially, Eve, who I believe used to be a rapper, I'm not quite sure, she asks him to share his lunch with her, and he says no, so obviously she's smitten because she fell for Kevin Bacon because he's Kevin Bacon. So she's kind of antagonistic. You have Mos Def as a policeman who keeps an eye on Kevin Bacon, and he actually has a nice little speech where we get the title of the film, The Woodsman. As he gets into his routine, he sees a guy with a car who's hanging about the schoolyard, so we hear his kind of commentary on what the guy's doing, and we've got that storyline. Obviously, he immediately is in a relationship with Kyra Sedgwick, because he's Kevin Bacon, obviously. I'm not sure that happens to most sex offenders when they come out of prison, but we learn about her past when he tells her his past, because obviously they have a what's the worst thing you've ever done conversation, which obviously turns a bit dark, but again, the film could have been darker. I know Kevin Bacon is a sex offender, how can it be darker? But at one point he makes it clear that he did not do any, I don't know how YouTube deals with it, he didn't do any full sexual behaviour, so it's just molestation. Again, I'm not saying just molestation, but obviously as a studio, as making films, it's Kevin Bacon, so yes, you can take the risk of having him molesting young girls, but to say, he's a full-blown, I don't mean full-blown, you know what I mean, child abuse is obviously horrific no matter what level it is, but I'm saying, if he was a killer of children, and then perhaps that just wouldn't, the film would have never been made. So he makes that clear at one point. Plus it has a strange, it doesn't have a happy ending, but it has a more kind of positive ending than probably is the truth. There is a beautiful scene because, his psychiatrist or psychologist, played by Michael Shannon, which must have been one of his earlier performances, asks him to keep a journal So he's writing down all these notes, but then as Mos Def starts pestering him more, he fears that will put him back in prison if he's writing down what he's thinking. And he does end up following a young girl who's bird watching and talking to her, and there is kind of the famous scene where he's talking to her, and during that conversation then perhaps a small penny might drop about his behaviour and how it actually affects his victims, which sometimes, or most of the time, I'm not going to make any statements that perhaps these people don't consider what damage has been done to the victims. But there's a chance, it's kind of inferred, that maybe he's realised, and whether that gives him a more hopeful future. So it is, at the end, it's not necessarily saying, oh yeah, he's never going to reoffend, everything's fine now, he's cured, he's not going to have those feelings or thoughts anymore. But it is perhaps a little bit more positive than you would imagine. Obviously this was never going to be a box office success. It is a brave film for Kevin Bacon to do, but at that point in his career he could almost do anything he wanted, and I guess it is one of those roles that actors perhaps want to have a go at. It's not quite Oscar bait, because he would have to have autism and have an alcohol problem and walk with a limp or something, and speak an invented language to be Oscar worthy. But again, it's a really good internal performance by Bacon. Obviously there's a bit of narration to help us know what he's thinking, but it's a really good, well shot, well acted film, and again, it doesn't come up with any answers. Again, as I say, it doesn't suggest that everything's going to be fine, but it does have a tiny little bit of hope, that maybe he's not going to reoffend. So that's perhaps a little bit darker Kevin Bacon than we're used to. Obviously he was the villain in Verhoeven's Hollow Man, which is a lot of fun. But that's The Woodsman from 2004, which is obviously just on DVD, and Death Sentence from 2007, directed by the director of Saw, just in case you didn't realise. One of them's fun, and the other one is obviously more serious, but well done. So please let me know in the comments whether you've seen Death Sentence or The Woodsman, whether you prefer dark Bacon or lighter Bacon. I mean, I would say, here's Kevin Bacon as a heartbroken father after revenge and a sex offender trying to go straight, and at no point does either of these characters go to a factory and dance to get his frustration out. It's a missed opportunity by both directors for me. Surely they could have snuck in at least a couple of minutes of dancing in an abandoned factory to get out frustration. I mean, Death Sentence ends in an abandoned hospital, so he could have had a dance before everything kicked off, but that's disappointing about both films as well. So this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.